When we talk about the future, one truth stands out clearly. The children being raised now are growing up in a very different landscape than any generation before them. They aren't inheriting the same unquestioned traditions or rigid belief systems that shaped the lives of their parents and grandparents. They're being shaped by information, by technology, by exposure to 1,000 perspectives that make them less likely to cling to old religious frameworks. This shift doesn't happen overnight. It's not about one child deciding they don't want to go to church anymore, or one teenager challenging their parents' faith. It's about slow, steady cultural movement. Each generation becomes less religious than the one before, and the numbers show this clearly. In many countries, particularly in the developed world, religious affiliation is in free fall. Surveys track it year after year, and the trend never reverses. It's not a matter of opinion, it's measurable. Children today have access to the kind of knowledge that once was locked away. Centuries ago, most people learned about the world through sacred texts and sermons. Now, a teenager with a phone in their pocket can explore astronomy, biology, philosophy, and history with a swipe of their finger. And when knowledge spreads, mystery shrinks. Religion has always thrived in mystery. When people didn't understand lightning, earthquakes, or disease, gods and spirits filled the gaps. But with every explanation discovered by science, those gaps close. Children growing up in an age where so much is explained don't feel the same need to accept supernatural answers. But it's not only science that reshapes them, it's also culture. Children are watching a world where diversity of thought is not only visible, but celebrated. They can see in real time that billions of people follow completely different faiths, each convinced theirs is true. For a child with a questioning mind, this is powerful. Why should one religion's story be right while all others are wrong? Why does geography decide belief? A child in one country may be raised to pray to a single God, while another, thousands of miles away, may learn there are hundreds of gods, or none at all. This inconsistency plants seeds of doubt, and once those seeds are there, blind faith rarely takes root. Education also plays a role. Modern education, at its best, emphasizes critical thinking. It encourages students to ask questions, weigh evidence, and recognize biases. This mindset naturally extends beyond school subjects. A child taught to question everything in science or history doesn't suddenly stop questioning when it comes to religion. And once the same standards are applied, the stories of sacred texts often can't withstand scrutiny. A child doesn't need to be hostile or rebellious to notice contradictions in Scripture, or to see the difference between evidence-based reasoning and tradition-based belief. There's also the simple matter of values. Religion has often claimed authority over morality. It insists that good and bad must be defined through divine command. But children today are raised in environments where empathy, fairness, and justice are explained in human terms. They can see moral progress happening without divine authority. They learn about slavery once being defended with scripture and later rejected through human reasoning. They see how women's rights, civil rights, and LGBTQ+ rights often advance despite resistance from religious institutions, not because of them. When children realize morality is shaped by human compassion and collective growth, religion loses one of its strongest claims to relevance. The internet has also changed everything. A child questioning their faith doesn't feel alone anymore. They don't have to sit in isolation, wondering if they're the only one doubting. With a few clicks, they find communities of people across the world who share their questions and doubts. This sense of belonging is powerful. In past generations, leaving religion could mean social isolation. Today, it can mean finding a new tribe, one that supports critical thinking and curiosity. Even psychology plays its part. Children are increasingly exposed to how the human brain works. They learn about cognitive biases, about how people see patterns even when none exist. They learn how easily humans can be influenced by authority, tradition, and emotion. Once you understand these mechanisms, faith doesn't feel like divine truth. It feels like psychology in action, and that realization is liberating. Some parents still cling tightly to religious instruction, but even there, children notice. They see when beliefs contradict observable reality. They see when dogma harms rather than helps. And in an age where compassion and evidence are often valued above obedience, those contradictions stand out sharply. And yet, the shift is not only intellectual, it's also deeply emotional. When children are taught that a God is watching them constantly, judging them for thoughts and actions, many feel fear rather than comfort. They grow up under pressure to conform, to confess, to obey. But when they discover that this invisible authority may not exist, they experience relief. A child who realizes their mistakes don't make them enemies of the universe, but simply human beings learning as they go, often feels freer and lighter. That emotional release once felt is hard to undo. We also need to recognize that young people are seeing religion's impact in real time. They watch news where conflicts are fueled by sectarian divides. They see political debates shaped more by scripture than by evidence. They see leaders justifying cruelty in the name of faith. For children raised in an interconnected world, it becomes harder to view religion as purely good. They're capable of recognizing both the comfort religion provides and the harm it causes. And in that recognition, many decide the balance doesn't justify belief. None of this means that every child will grow up without religion. Some will hold on to it, some will find meaning in rituals or traditions, but the overall trajectory is clear. When we project the current trends into the future, it points in one direction. The children of today are less religious than their parents, and their children will likely be less religious still. Faith fades when knowledge, communication, and empathy take its place. This isn't about arrogance. It isn't about thinking our generation is smarter than the past. It's about context. Children are simply being raised in a world where answers are abundant, diversity is visible, and values are increasingly rooted in human understanding. In such a world, religion has less and less room to grow. Children today are also watching the decline of religious authority unfold in front of them. They hear about scandals involving leaders of faith who preached morality while living in contradiction to their own rules. They see religious institutions fighting to preserve outdated ideas rather than leading the way toward progress. When children are taught to respect honesty and integrity, and then they see hypocrisy in places that claim ultimate truth, the effect is lasting. They don't forget it. At the same time, children are living in a period where knowledge of the universe feels vast, yet approachable. A kid can open a video and see stars forming, galaxies colliding, black holes bending light. They can read about evolution explaining the diversity of life, with evidence stretching back millions of years. They can learn about DNA, the human brain, and the history of civilizations with stunning detail. These things aren't abstract, they're concrete, tested, demonstrated, and compared to them, the stories offered by ancient texts feel small, simplified, and outdated. When a child holds both side by side, the choice of which to trust feels obvious. Another factor shaping the future is that children are no longer raised in closed bubbles. Globalization exposes them to ways of living their parents never encountered. A teenager in one part of the world can listen to the music, watch the films, and read the words of people halfway across the planet. And with that exposure comes the recognition that belief is not universal. Religion stops feeling like a universal truth and begins to look like cultural inheritance. A child can see this clearly. You believe what your parents and community teach you, but when they realize belief depends on accident of birth, the authority of religion weakens dramatically. It's also important to recognize the role of freedom. In previous generations, questioning religion often carried punishment. In some places it still does, but in more and more societies, Freedom of thought is protected. Children sense this. They see that it's possible to live openly without following a faith, without shame or guilt. And once that door is visible, many will walk through it. Technology has sped up this process in subtle ways too. Artificial intelligence, virtual reality, biotechnology. These advances reshape how children think about the human condition. They're growing up knowing that we can map the human genome, transplant organs, and even edit DNA. They're growing up knowing that intelligence can be replicated in machines and that consciousness itself might be explained one day by neuroscience. When confronted with these breakthroughs, the idea that morality, purpose, or identity depends on supernatural claims feels unnecessary. Children are also being shaped by the way religion interacts with politics. They see how laws are influenced by religious doctrine, and they watch as debates about human rights often come down to old verses. For a young mind, this creates tension. Why should ancient writings determine the future of human beings today? Why should personal freedom depend on scripture? These questions arise naturally, and when they do, faith loses ground. At the same time, children notice the everyday contradictions. They see religious leaders urging compassion while condemning groups of people for who they love. They see calls for peace alongside prayers for enemies to be destroyed. They see communities preaching humility while building empires of wealth. And children, often more honest than adults, are quick to say what they see. They call out hypocrisy more easily, and once that's done, blind obedience becomes impossible. Another under-discussed point is how secular rituals are replacing religious ones. In the past, meaning was tied to baptism, communion, confirmation, and prayer. Now, children experience meaning through different avenues. They find community in schools, sports, clubs, and online spaces. They experience awe at concerts, museums, scientific discoveries, and shared human achievements. The emotional need that religion once filled is being met in other ways. And when those needs are met without supernatural belief, religion becomes redundant. It's worth noting too that parents themselves are changing. Many modern parents, even if religious, are less strict about forcing faith on their children. They emphasize choice, exploration, and authenticity. And children raised in an environment of choice rarely pick the option that feels like constraint. If religion is one option among many rather than the unquestioned default, it rarely wins. The psychological aspect is even more profound. Children learn about mental health in ways earlier generations never did. They understand depression, anxiety, trauma, and resilience in scientific terms. They know that prayer is not a substitute for therapy, that medication and counseling help more than rituals. They understand that minds can heal through science and community rather than divine intervention. When children see their friends supported by these means rather than by faith, belief in supernatural healing feels less convincing. Even art and storytelling contribute to this shift. Children are surrounded by narratives that don't rely on gods. Films, books, and games explore morality, sacrifice, and hope without requiring divine scripts. These cultural touchpoints matter. A child who learns empathy from a novel or courage from a film understands that meaning can come from human imagination and shared stories, not just holy texts. And then there's the growing conversation around climate change, the environment, and the planet's future. Children see clearly that the problems facing humanity are not solved by prayer. They're solved by cooperation, science, and action. When faith tells them the world was created for humans, but evidence shows the world is fragile and requires stewardship, the evidence wins. In the struggle between myths of dominion and facts of responsibility, the facts are more persuasive. The trend is clear. Children raised in this environment, surrounded by evidence, diversity, freedom, and compassion, will lean toward disbelief, not because they reject tradition out of anger, but because belief feels unnecessary. The future belongs to clarity, and clarity does not need superstition. There's also a generational memory forming. Young people are growing up hearing how past generations fought bitterly over issues that today feel settled. They hear about times when interracial marriage was condemned from pulpits, when women were told to stay silent because scripture demanded it, when entire communities were excluded in the name of faith. And they notice how much of that moral progress came not from religion, but against its resistance. When they compare those histories to the present, the conclusion is hard to avoid. Religion does not reliably lead humanity forward, it often holds it back. Children are especially sensitive to fairness. From the earliest age, they understand the difference between justice and injustice, between being treated equally and being excluded. When they encounter religious teachings that divide people into insiders and outsiders, saved and damned, righteous and sinful, they see the unfairness quickly. A child may not phrase it in philosophical terms, but they know instinctively that kindness should not depend on belonging to the right group. And once that thought is clear, religious boundaries lose their authority. Another striking factor is exposure to doubt within religious communities themselves. Children overhear their parents or relatives debating, questioning, struggling with faith. They notice when a prayer doesn't bring the answer promised. They notice when even adults who are supposed to be certain carry hidden doubts. And if adults themselves wrestle with belief, why should children hold on to it unquestioningly? That awareness spreads quietly, but steadily. There's also the growing awareness of how religions often mirror each other. When children compare stories across faiths, they notice repeated themes: virgin births, flood myths, divine messengers, miracles, resurrections. Once they see the pattern, the uniqueness of any single religion dissolves. These aren't eternal truths, they're recycled human stories. For a child raised with access to information, spotting these overlaps is unavoidable. And once you've seen the pattern, it's hard to unsee. The role of humor shouldn't be overlooked either. Children today are growing up in a world saturated with satire, comedy, and commentary. Online platforms are full of jokes about belief and disbelief alike. Humor disarms authority. When you can laugh at something, it no longer terrifies you. For past generations, questioning religion could be frightening. It risked hellfire, shame, and rejection. But when children see people laughing at once sacred ideas, fear loses its grip, and freedom to question grows. Let's not forget the impact of science fiction and speculative thought. Many children explore stories that present alternative visions of reality, worlds with no gods, or with entirely different systems of meaning. Science fiction in particular primes the mind to think about humanity's place in the cosmos without leaning on tradition. When children watch shows or read books that explore morality, justice, and purpose in human terms, it expands their sense of possibility. And those possibilities often feel richer and more inspiring than the narrow confines of ancient dogma. Another important point: children today see authority questioned everywhere. Politicians, corporations, schools, even the media. No authority is beyond criticism. Religion, which once sat above scrutiny, is now just another institution subject to questioning. And once you strip away the aura of unquestionable power, faith traditions look like what they are: human creations with human flaws. Children also learn quickly about manipulation. They're taught about advertising, persuasion, propaganda. They learn how images and words can be used to shape behavior and belief. And once they see those same techniques used in religion, the repetition, the rituals, the emotional appeals, they can recognize the pattern. The curtain is pulled back. What once felt sacred starts to look like strategy. This shift has another dimension: personal autonomy. Modern parenting and education emphasize individuality, self-expression, and authenticity. Children are told to be themselves, to pursue their passions, to trust their own experiences. Religion, on the other hand, often demands conformity. It asks children to believe, obey, and conform even when it clashes with personal intuition. And for a generation raised to value authenticity, that demand feels suffocating. They don't reject religion because they hate it, but because it doesn't fit the way they've been taught to live as genuine individuals. We can also see how religious fear is losing power. Concepts like eternal punishment, demons, or divine wrath once terrified children into obedience. But today, those images don't carry the same weight. Movies, games, and stories portray fantastical creatures far scarier than anything in scripture, and children know they aren't real. Once you've faced dragons and cosmic horrors on a screen, the threat of a fiery underworld feels less convincing. Fear, once religion's strongest weapon, becomes just another story. And yet, none of this means that children are growing up cold or disconnected. Quite the opposite. They're learning empathy in broader, deeper ways. They're exposed to people from every background, every belief, every orientation. They're encouraged to see humanity as one interconnected web. That kind of empathy does not depend on divine command. It arises naturally from seeing others as fully human. And it may be the most powerful reason religion loses ground, because its exclusivity looks small compared to the universal compassion children are learning to practice. The result of all these forces is subtle but unstoppable. The children of today are not waiting for a single dramatic moment of rejection. They are simply growing up in an environment where belief is less necessary, less convincing, and less appealing. Where knowledge is abundant, empathy is real, and meaning is found in human life itself. In such an environment, religion doesn't collapse overnight. It simply fades, generation by generation. There's also a demographic reality at play. Studies show that religious families often have more children, but those children are less likely to stay religious as they grow. The moment they step into schools, meet peers from other backgrounds, or encounter the wider world through media, the foundation begins to crack. Even when faith is handed down carefully, it doesn't always take root in the next generation. Children inherit rituals, but they don't always inherit belief. Part of this comes from the transparency of information. A child who once might have quietly wondered why their religion forbids certain foods or clothing can now search the answer online and discover that the reasons were cultural, political, or historical, not divine. They realize that the rules they're taught as sacred often reflect the concerns of ancient societies, not eternal truths. And when children see that, the spell weakens. It's also about honesty. Many children today are encouraged to value honesty above all, to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable, to admit when they don't know something, to be open about their feelings. Religion, however, often punishes doubt or disagreement. It asks children to say, "I believe," even when they don't, to nod along even when their mind resists. That clash is hard to reconcile. A child raised to be honest finds it difficult to live with a faith that demands silence or pretense. The role of technology in identity can't be ignored either. Children are documenting their lives, expressing themselves, and shaping their identities online. They share their thoughts and experiences in ways previous generations never could. This exposure to constant dialogue makes rigid, one-size-fits-all doctrines less appealing. In an online world where individuality is celebrated, faith's insistence on conformity feels outdated. We should also think about how children understand evidence. From an early age, they're taught through science education that claims require proof, that experiments must be repeatable, that conclusions can change when new data arrives. Religion often offers the opposite: certainty without evidence, answers without proof. And when children compare the two systems, one feels reliable while the other feels fragile. Evidence doesn't always provide comfort, but it provides trust, and trust matters more than comfort in the long run. Even art and music reflect this shift. Children are growing up listening to artists who speak openly about doubt, about rejecting old norms, about building meaning without religion. Popular culture becomes a teacher, a mirror of change. When your favorite artist or storyteller finds inspiration outside religion, you realize you can too. And the emotional resonance of that discovery is stronger than any sermon. Something rarely discussed is the way children observe how religion handles questions of suffering. They see tragedies happen, earthquakes, diseases, accidents, and they hear religious explanations about divine will or mysterious plans. But those explanations rarely satisfy. Children often ask blunt, direct questions. Why would a loving God allow this? Why do good people suffer while bad people prosper? Adults may dodge these questions, but children notice the evasions, and when answers never come, belief loses credibility. At the same time, children are learning that comfort can come from other sources. Therapy, friendship, art, community, these provide solace without needing supernatural justification. When a child experiences real comfort from human connection, the idea that only religion offers peace becomes unnecessary. We also can't ignore the power of science communication. From documentaries to podcasts, from YouTube channels to interactive apps, children are constantly exposed to engaging explanations of reality. They see charismatic scientists explaining black holes, ocean depths, ancient civilizations, and human psychology with enthusiasm and clarity. And when you can learn about reality in such an inspiring way, religion feels less like truth and more like story. Another dimension is activism. Children are growing up in movements, climate strikes, equality marches, campaigns for justice. They see that change comes from collective action, not from prayer. They discover that meaning is made through action, not waiting. And when they taste the power of activism, faith feels passive by comparison. Generational shifts are rarely simple, but this one is undeniable. Religion no longer defines the default worldview of childhood. It's becoming one option among many, and one that fewer and fewer children choose. Because when everything else around you encourages curiosity, diversity, honesty, and evidence, belief without proof feels out of place. And so, the world of tomorrow will not look like the world of yesterday. Our children will carry forward stories, traditions, and rituals in some cases, but fewer and fewer will carry forward unquestioned faith. The balance is changing, and once it tips far enough, the idea of children growing up fully religious will become the exception rather than the rule. The trajectory is already clear. With each passing year, fewer children are raised inside strict religious structures, and even those who are rarely stay there forever. The reasons are not hidden, they're all around us. Access to knowledge, exposure to diversity, the value of honesty, the demand for evidence, the hunger for fairness, and the universal desire to live freely and authentically. Children are not rejecting belief out of spite or rebellion. They're simply growing up in a world where belief no longer answers their questions, no longer shapes their values, and no longer defines their identity. They're choosing clarity over mystery, connection over division, and reality over tradition. This doesn't mean the future will be empty of meaning. In fact, it means meaning will be found in richer places, in human relationships, in scientific discovery, in creativity, in the pursuit of justice and compassion. The awe that once belonged to religion is not disappearing, it's transforming. It's being directed toward the stars, toward the human mind, toward the endless possibilities of life itself. And that is why our children will be different, not bound by the fears and certainties of the past, but free to build a future guided by curiosity, empathy, and reason. They won't need the old stories to find comfort or the old rules to find purpose. They'll create their own meaning together in a way that honors the truth of the world they actually live in. The myths will fade, but the wonder will remain. The rituals may fall away, but the search for connection will continue. The gods
may be forgotten, but humanity will endure, stronger, freer, and more honest than before. That is why our children will not inherit the beliefs of yesterday. That is why they will move forward, not backward. And that is why our children will be atheists.